February 27th, 1943. Night had settled over the mountains of occupied Norway, and somewhere above the town of Rjukan, a small group of Norwegian commandos stood facing a problem that could end their mission before they ever reached their target. Below them was the Vemork industrial complex. Inside it was something the Allies desperately wanted destroyed: Germany's most important source of heavy water, a material connected to the Nazi nuclear research program. But between the commandos and the factory stood a deep gorge. The obvious route was a narrow suspension bridge. The Germans knew that too, so they guarded it. Another approach led across ground threatened by mines. That left one possibility: the route the Germans apparently considered too difficult to use. The men could descend hundreds of feet into the frozen gorge, cross the icy river at the bottom, then climb the almost sheer wall on the other side. In darkness, in winter, carrying weapons and explosives. And if they managed all of that, the real mission had not even begun. They still had to enter a German-controlled factory, locate the heavy water equipment, place explosives, escape before the charges detonated, and then somehow disappear into occupied Norway. There would be no large assault force coming behind them, no tanks, no artillery, and no easy rescue if something went wrong. Their mission seemed blocked by geography itself, but geography was about to become the very thing that allowed them inside. To understand why a handful of men were willing to attempt such a dangerous crossing, we have to go back nearly 3 years. Germany invaded Norway in April 1940. Among the industrial facilities that came under German control was the Norsk hydro complex at Vemork, near Rjukan. Vemork was already remarkable. Built into a dramatic mountain landscape, the industrial site used enormous amounts of hydroelectric power. Among its products was heavy water. Heavy water looks much like ordinary water, but chemically it is different. Its hydrogen atoms contain an additional neutron. That small difference made it useful as a moderator in certain types of experimental nuclear reactors, and that made Vemork important. German scientists were investigating nuclear fission, and German researchers had chosen heavy water as one possible material for helping sustain a nuclear chain reaction. British intelligence therefore watched German interest in Vemork with growing concern. The Allies did not know exactly how close Germany was to producing a nuclear weapon. That uncertainty was the danger. They knew Germany possessed skilled physicists. They knew the Germans wanted more heavy water. And they knew Vemork was capable of producing it on an industrial scale. Soon after the occupation, heavy water production was ordered to increase dramatically. To British planners, allowing that production to continue represented a risk they were unwilling to accept. Destroying the facility, however, was not simple. Vemork was almost a fortress created by nature. Mountains surrounded it. Winter weather could become lethal. The heavy water equipment itself was protected inside the industrial complex, and German troops controlled the area. The British Special Operations Executive began working with Norwegians who understood the terrain, the factory, and the local population. One of the key figures was Leif Tronstad, a Norwegian scientist who possessed detailed knowledge of the heavy water operation. Information from Norway slowly made its way to Britain. Plans were developed, men were trained. And in October 1942, 4 Norwegian agents parachuted onto the Hardangervidda plateau. Their code name was Grouse. Their task was to prepare for a larger British attack called Operation Freshman. Freshman would send British troops into Norway by glider. The Norwegians on the ground would guide them toward Vemork. If everything worked, the heavy water installation would be destroyed. But almost nothing worked. On November 19, 1942, the aircraft carrying the assault force encountered terrible conditions. Navigation became difficult. Icing affected the aircraft. The gliders failed to reach the planned landing area. One bomber and both gliders crashed in Norway. Some men died during the crashes. Those who survived were captured. They were later executed by the Germans. 41 men were lost. The factory remained standing, and the 4 Norwegians of Grouse were still hiding in the mountains. Winter closed around them. They could not simply walk back to Britain. They remained on the Hardangervidda plateau through some of the harshest conditions in Europe. Food became a problem. Supplies were limited. They hunted reindeer and tried to survive while waiting for London to decide what would happen next. The failed operation had also changed the situation around Vemork. The Germans now had strong reason to believe the factory was a target. Another large airborne attack risked repeating the disaster. So the next attempt would be different, smaller, quieter, Norwegian. The new mission was given the codename Gunnerside. 6 Norwegian commandos were selected. Their leader was Joachim Ronneberg. He was only 23 years old. The others were Knut Haukelid, Fredrik Kaiser, Kasper Eidland, Hans Storhaug, and Birger Stromsheim. These were not men being sent to conquer a town. Their task was much more precise. Reach Vemork, get inside, destroy the heavy water production equipment, and get out. On February 16, 1943, the Gunnerside team parachuted onto the Hardangervidda. Even this stage almost went wrong. They landed away from their intended location. Equipment was nearly lost. Bad weather slowed them. Finding the original Norwegian team was difficult. For approximately a week, the two groups searched through the winter landscape before finally joining together. By then, the men who had spent months isolated in the mountains were thin and exhausted. But now the attack force finally existed. The mission could begin. On the evening of February 27th, the men moved toward Vemork, and soon they reached the decision on which everything depended. The bridge offered the easiest physical route. It also offered the easiest place for German guards to stop them. The upper approaches were dangerous, so they chose the Gorge. From the plateau, they descended toward the river far below. The terrain was steep. Snow and ice covered the landscape. A mistake could injure a man, damage the explosives, or make enough noise to alert someone above. At the bottom, they crossed the half-frozen river. Then came the climb. The opposite wall rose roughly 500 feet. The Germans had concentrated their defenses on the routes that sensible attackers were expected to use. The commandos were approaching through the route that sensible attackers would avoid. That was precisely why it could work. Slowly, the men climbed out of the gorge. They reached the railway on the Vemork side. The factory was now close, but the greatest danger had changed. Minutes earlier, the enemy had been cold, ice, darkness, and gravity. Now it was human. German guards were nearby. The commandos waited while the guards on the bridge changed shifts. Then they continued. A fence still stood between them and the target. Ronneberg had brought heavy wire cutters. It was a small detail, almost insignificant compared with parachutes, explosives, and military training. But small details decide sabotage missions. The fence was cut. The men moved through. 9 commandos now formed the direct raiding force, divided between an explosives party and a covering group. The explosives team approached the building, and then another problem appeared. The door they intended to use was locked. They were almost beside their target, yet still outside it. Breaking through loudly could alert the guards. Turning back would mean that the freezing journey across the mountains and gorge had accomplished nothing. Ronneberg searched for another entrance. He found a narrow access route connected with the building. He and Fredrik Kaiser squeezed through. For a moment, they believed the rest of the demolition party was following. They were not. The men had become separated. Inside a German-controlled industrial plant, with limited time and explosives in their hands, Ronneberg and Kaiser faced another decision. Wait, search, or continue with only 2 men. They continued. Kasper Eidland and Birger Stromsheim eventually found another way inside through a window. The demolition team was reunited, and now, finally, they were standing beside the equipment they had crossed occupied Europe's frozen landscape to destroy. There was no dramatic firefight, no heroic speech. The men worked. Explosive charges were placed beside the heavy water production cells. Ronneberg shortened the fuses. The original timing would have given them roughly 2 minutes. He reduced it to about 30 seconds. There was a reason. He wanted enough time to leave, but he also wanted to hear the explosion. If he could hear it, he would know the charges had detonated before the men disappeared into the mountains. Then something happened that reminded everyone inside that this was not an empty military installation. A Norwegian worker was nearby. According to accounts of the operation, the commandos allowed him time to retrieve his spectacles before leaving. It was a tiny human detail in an operation involving nuclear research, occupation, and explosives. Then the fuse was lit. The men began moving out. Seconds passed, and behind them came the explosion. It was not the enormous blast that a Hollywood version of the story might require. It did not destroy the entire Vemork complex. It did something more precise. It destroyed the heavy water production cells. Around 500 kilograms of heavy water were lost. The sabotage team escaped without being discovered in time to stop them. No member of the raiding party was killed. No member was captured. And according to the official Norwegian commemoration of the operation, the raid was completed without the commandos firing a shot. But destroying the equipment was only half the problem. Now the Germans would know exactly what had happened. The commandos had to vanish. Some returned through the same natural barrier that had helped them enter, down toward the gorge, across, then back toward the mountains. Once the group reached the plateau, the men separated. 5 members of Gunnerside, Ronneberg, Stromsheim, Eidland, Storhaug, and Kaiser, began an extraordinary escape toward neutral Sweden. They traveled on skis across more than 200 miles of winter terrain. Others remained in Norway and continued resistance work. German forces searched for the attackers, but the men escaped capture. For the Allies, the immediate objective had been achieved, but the larger story was not finished. Heavy water production at Vemork eventually resumed. The Germans repaired the installation within months. That fact matters because Operation Gunnerside is sometimes presented as though one explosion suddenly ended Germany's nuclear ambitions. The reality is more complicated. By 1943, Germany was not standing on the verge of possessing an operational atomic bomb. The German nuclear effort suffered from limited resources, organizational problems, and scientific difficulties. Historians have therefore debated exactly how much the Vemork sabotage changed the eventual outcome of the nuclear race. But the commandos did not have the luxury of knowing that in February 1943. Neither did Allied planners. They were acting with incomplete intelligence during a world war. They knew Germany wanted heavy water. They knew heavy water could be useful in a reactor. And they knew that allowing an enemy nuclear program to progress without interference was a risk with potentially enormous consequences. The mission bought time and disrupted Germany's supply of a material its researchers considered important, and Vemork would become a target again. On November 16, 1943, American bombers attacked the industrial complex. The raid damaged the area but also killed 22 civilians. German authorities eventually decided to move equipment and remaining heavy water material out of Norway. That produced another desperate act of sabotage. In February 1944, Norwegian resistance members placed explosives aboard the ferry Hydro, which was being used in the German transport effort across Lake Tinn. The ferry sank. 4 German soldiers and 14 Norwegian civilians were killed. The heavy water struggle had become far more costly than the almost bloodless raid carried out by Ronneberg and his men 1 year earlier. And that contrast is part of what makes Operation Gunnerside remarkable. A larger British operation had already ended in catastrophe. Later bombing would kill civilians. The ferry sabotage would also cost innocent lives. Yet on the night of February 27th and 28th, 1943, a small group entered one of the most strategically important industrial sites in occupied Norway, destroyed its target, and escaped without losing a man. Their success did not come from overwhelming firepower. It came from preparation, local knowledge, discipline, and repeatedly choosing the option the enemy believed was least likely. The Germans guarded the bridge because the bridge made sense. The commandos crossed the gorge because it did not. They entered through an unexpected route because the intended door failed them. When the demolition party became separated, 2 men continued instead of allowing confusion to destroy the opportunity. At nearly every stage, the plan had to adapt to reality. And perhaps that is the most important part of the story. Operation Gunnerside is remembered as one of the great sabotage missions of the Second World War. But its most dramatic moment was not the explosion. It happened earlier, in the darkness above Vemork, when a group of men looked down into a frozen gorge and understood that the safest German defense had created an unexpected weakness. The route that appeared impossible was almost completely unguarded. So they descended. They crossed the ice. They climbed the cliff. And hours later, the equipment they had been sent across occupied Europe to destroy was lying damaged behind them. Sometimes a fortress is strongest where everyone expects an attack, and weakest where no one believes an attack can come from at all.